Last year, as we read about being inscribed in the book of life, my family prayed that we would get one more year with my father. As many of you know, we lost him the week before Thanksgiving. It's been 10 months, and most days I still don't believe that he's not here anymore. All the holidays have been hard without him, but the High Holy Days are particularly difficult. Rosh Hashanah was the one holiday where my parents always joined me for services, no matter where in the country I was leading. They also played an active role in reviewing my sermons. My mother continues to offer generous praise, gentle suggestions to include more personal stories, and soothing reminders that I do indeed finish this task every year. My father, on the other hand, was eagle-eyed when it came to logical inconsistencies and often poked holes in my arguments. He was deeply concerned with questions of theodicy, why we suffer, and of justice, how we make things right. He asked good questions and gave hard-earned praise. And on nights like tonight, he would sit in the sanctuary with a look of quiet contemplation on his face. I miss all of your faces in the sanctuary this year, but I miss his the most. So it's only fitting that my dad would help me write one more sermon from his seat in the heavenly Beit Midrash, where in addition to Talmud, I hope they also have the Wall Street Journal and Radio Lab. My father was not a religious man, but he always walked to synagogue on Yom Kippur. We said this was his tribute to Sandy Koufax, who refused to play in the World Series on the Day of Atonement. My father wasn't much for praying either, but he liked to read the stories of the sages in Gates of Repentance and later the footnotes in Mishkan HaNefesh. And in a way, my father's life was a High Holy Day sermon. At this season, we recognize our shortcomings and pledge to work on ourselves. As the middle child of first-generation parents, my father never thought he was good enough. Some of this was humility, a willingness to work behind the scenes and let other people shine, usually me and my brothers. And some of this was a crippling imposter complex, which he very generously passed down to me. My father lived with a constant awareness that his time was limited. His father had also died in his 60s, and my dad had successfully fought a terminal illness already in his 30s. He didn't take life for granted, and he wanted to make the most of it, though he didn't always know exactly how. He was always trying to improve himself and learn new things. In midlife, he took up woodworking and learned to play the oboe, hoping one day for the privilege of tuning the Philadelphia Orchestra, then immediately leaving the stage before he could do any further damage. At my brother's insistence, he tried meditation and hiking. At my urging, we studied Pirkei Avot, the ethics of our fathers. I have always been fascinated by the Jewish custom of ethical wills, in which generations of Jews have shared their wisdom, their values, and their formative experiences with their descendants. But by the time I summoned the courage to start working on an ethical will with my father, it was too late for a meaningful conversation. But he didn't entirely leave us hanging, because tacked above the computer in his home office were a list of his own rules for life. Be here, be good, no evil, priorities, and say what you need. I naively thought that this sermon would be the easiest one to write, since my dad had essentially outlined it for me. But this was the first one I started, and of course the last one I finished, because I so wanted it to be worthy of him, and I still feel it isn't. Part of me wanted to just drop his teachings and walk away. He was concise like that. But my dad would have called that lazy, and demanded further exegesis on the source material. For my dad, the best sermons were a fulfillment of a riddle from my favorite childhood movie, Sesame Street's Don't Eat the Pictures. The riddle was, where does today meet yesterday? So I thought I'd see where I might connect my father's wisdom to yesterday's tradition and our current moment. My father's first rule was be here. One commonality between the private grief of losing a loved one and the collective grief we are experiencing during this pandemic is that we feel robbed of both our present and our future. When we lose a loved one, we miss their daily presence, but also the experiences we won't get to share with them in the future. This is also true in our global situation. We are limited in what we can do in this moment, and also in what we can plan for the future, because we don't know how things are going to unfold. Now, this has always been true, but when things are going well, we often live under the illusion that we have some control, that there's always going to be more time, and that there's always going to be somewhere else to be and something else to do. We forget that everything can change in an instant. Dr. Kate Bowler, a professor at Duke Divinity School, wrote about this phenomenon in her book, Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lies I've Loved. As a happily married young mother, a successful academic, and a writer, Bowler felt that she had a lot to look forward to, and she spent a lot of time doing just that, looking forward. After her own terminal cancer diagnosis, she realized that she hadn't really been present at all for all of these wonderful things. She writes, I believed that I was living in the center, but I rarely let my feet rest on solid ground, rooting me in the present. On long walks, I forever roped my husband into my favorite topic, the next thing. How could we improve our lives? What should we do next? As we walked through the tall Carolina oaks on a fall trail dusted with technicolor leaves, my mind hummed with possible futures. If I were to invent a sin to describe what that was, it was the sin of arrogance, of becoming impervious to life itself. I failed to love what was present and decided to love what was possible instead. We might not have committed many of the big sins we just listed in our confessional tonight, but we've probably all done this one. Hillel's teaching, if not now, when, can be a call to action, but it is also a reminder to be present. It is tempting to just power through in these difficult times. But if anything, these times have made me realize how many of us are doing this all the time, just powering through. If we are not cultivating gratitude and seeking joy now, if we are not being present with our loved ones and considering our direction now, if we are not practicing kindness and pursuing justice now when so much is on hold, when exactly do we plan to do that? My father's second rule was be good. Rabbi Shimon tells us that there are 3 crowns: the crown of Torah, the crown of priesthood, and the crown of royalty. But the crown of a good name is greater than them all. My father would point out that this actually makes 4 crowns. Having a good name was important to my father, and sharing his name with the serial killer son of Sam, this was no easy task. It also made crossing the border difficult. But if there was anything that was widely known about my father, it was that he was a fundamentally good person. Still, my father was deeply concerned about his legacy and his impact. Having been sick during much of our childhood, his only wish was that he live long enough for us to remember him. Many who worked with him valued him as a colleague and a mentor, and this was important to him too. But years ago, at the funeral of a colleague who had been active in their church, my father decided to find more ways to contribute to his community. This was, in part, he said, because I don't want the new rabbi to call me daddy. He wanted to establish his own name, and he did. First on the board of our synagogue and later as president, and then on the board of Mainline Health. In both places, he became known for his intellect, his hard work, and his equanimity in heated situations, something I am striving to learn from him still. These days, it is necessary to distinguish between one's good name and one's social media brand. My dad hated social media and refused to participate. Having a good name is not about making sure everyone knows who we are, or that we have a lot of likes or followers. It is what people know of our character, whether or not they can rely on us, and whether knowing us enriches their lives. The humorist Leo Roston once said, "The purpose of life is not to be happy, but to matter, to be productive, to be useful, to have it make some difference that you lived at all." My father's third rule was no evil. There's a story about a man who approaches the ancient Rabbi Shammai and says, "I will convert to Judaism on the condition that you teach me the entire Torah while standing on one foot." Thinking he's being a wise guy, Shammai smacks him with a yardstick. But when the man visits Hillel, the response is different. "What is hateful to you, do not do to any person. That is the whole Torah. All the rest is commentary. Go and learn it." Doing no harm can be difficult enough nowadays. In the television show The Good Place, the characters learn that humans are being disproportionately punished in the afterlife because everything has become so morally complicated by globalism. One character keeps insisting that he was a good person, then exclaims, "Oh no, I used almond milk in my coffee even though I knew about the negative environmental impact." My father was known amongst his colleagues and friends as being fiercely moral, living and working with honesty and integrity. He also supported many causes that combated poverty and injustice because he knew that no evil meant more than doing no harm. It means rooting out evil where we find it and leaving no space for it to flourish. Many have said during the past few years that if we wonder what we would have done during the civil rights movement or the Holocaust, it's whatever we're doing right now. No evil means that we must be willing to stick our necks out to fight the injustices in our society. We are still in mourning for Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who prayed that she would be remembered as someone who used whatever talent she had to do her work to the very best of her ability and to help repair tears in her society, to make things a little better through the use of whatever ability she has, to do something outside myself. Or as Hillel said, "If I am only for myself, what am I?" For a while, I tried to figure out what my father meant as the difference between be good and no evil. But it's actually the similarity that strikes me. They are both active. We can't just mind our business. We have to actively put good in the world and combat evil when we see it. My father's fourth rule was priorities. One of my favorite Passover teachings is that the word matzah shares its letters with the word mitzvah, our sacred obligations. Just as matzah needs to be cooked quickly or risk becoming chametz or fermented, so do mitzvot need to be done right away. Rabbi Yoshaya says, just as one does not let matzah sit and sour, so too do not let the mitzvah sit and sour. Contemporary rabbis Michael Katz and Gershon Schwartz turn this sentiment into a pun extravaganza. They say, just as matzah dough eventually rises, whether we want it to or not, and is spoiled, so too opportunities slip by, like it or not, and are lost. We may cause the various meanings of the Hebrew root chametz to happen to us. Our relationships may sour. We may find ourselves in a pickle with those we care about the most. We may no longer be able to get a rise out of those whose love and opinions matter so much to us. Once again, we hear the echo of Hillel's teaching, if not now, when? My father is the second generation in his family who worked hard their whole lives and didn't live long enough to enjoy retirement, who gave everything to their families and rarely asked for anything for themselves. Which leads me to my father's last rule: say what you need. The Shabbat before my father died, I listened to Asher Weinstock read his Haftarah portion at his bar mitzvah, the story of Elisha the prophet. In this passage, a poor widow approaches the prophet Elisha, telling him, "My husband has died, and now a creditor is coming to seize my 2 children as slaves." Elisha responds, "Tell me, what have you in the house?" She replies, "Nothing at all, except a jug of oil." Elisha instructs the woman to borrow empty vessels from her neighbors, then pour oil from the original jar into the empty vessels until it runs out. But it doesn't run out. The oil miraculously keeps flowing until all the vessels are filled. When the widow relays this news to Elisha, the prophet says, "Go and sell the oil and pay your debt, and you and your children can live on what remains." In this rare moment of respite between trips to the ICU, I found comfort in Elisha's promise, as if he had taken my hand and said, "You and your family are going to be okay." Elisha solves the widow's immediate problem with a miracle, but he also does something important for her community. He requires the woman to ask for what she needs. Her neighbors must bear witness to both her family's private sorrow and the systemic injustice of debt slavery. A prophet like Elisha might bring about a miracle, but ordinary people must also play a role in our redemption. Sometimes this means we have to bear witness to our neighbors and for the stranger in our midst. And sometimes that means having to ask for what we need ourselves. My father was diagnosed with lung cancer a month before I arrived at Kolami. Keeping his illness private for those 18 months was my parents' wish. They wanted us all to keep working and living our lives until we couldn't do so anymore. But it was also my wish. As your new rabbi, I didn't want you to feel like you had to take care of me. But one thing I learned when the worst thing imaginable happened was that this community would take care of me when I needed it, and you continue to do so to this day. We support each other best when we show up and when we bear witness to each other's pain. But sometimes our pain isn't visible to our neighbors. Only by saying what we need can we invite others to support us. As Hillel said, "If I am not for myself, who will be for me?" So this was my father's ethical will of sorts. Be here, be good, no evil, priorities, and say what you need. But perhaps the most important part of this teaching was that although he probably never thought he had it quite right, he took the time to crystallize what was important to him, place it in the forefront of his vision, and leave it somewhere where his children could find it. My father didn't mean for this to become our family credo. That wasn't his style. He left it for us so that we could use it to develop our own rules for living. Mine might look a little different, and so might yours. But the task of our lives is to gather wisdom from those who touch our lives. Our task is to live our lives as best we can in alignment with that wisdom, and to leave something behind for the next generation to make sense of. There's no easy way, of course, to end this sermon. Making sense of my father's life, his words, and his absence will be a lifelong process for me and my family. So I thought instead I'd share a piece of his favorite poem by Rabbi Lawrence Kushner, who likened each lifetime to the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. But know this, Kushner writes, no one has within themselves all the pieces to their puzzle. Everyone carries with them at least one, and probably many pieces to someone else's puzzle. Sometimes they know it, sometimes they don't. And when you present your piece, which is worthless to you, to another, whether you know it or not, whether they know it or not, you are a messenger from the Most High. Gemar Chatima Tova.